If you don't want to be recorded, just please turn your screen off so that we can share this with others. And I'm going to go ahead and I'll be just a moment. I'm going to make this live. Okay. All right. Well, welcome everybody to Detroit. Today we are joined by 5 amazing panelists. I'm very excited for this. We are joined by Rabbi Stephen Rubenstein from Congregation Beth Am. They have a H in between Beth Am, between Am. So we're Temple Beth Am for those who don't know on this program. We're also joined by Stephen Ingber, who's the CEO of the Jewish Federation of Metropolitan Detroit. We have Arthur Horowitz, who has been publishing since 1986 the Detroit Jewish News. He is the founder and president of the independent nonprofit Detroit Jewish News Foundation and the principal of Ren Media and Renaissance Media Solutions. We're also joined by Rabbi Bennett of Temple Israel and Joel Tauber, who has been a Jewish leader and philanthropist in the community for many years. So with that said, I asked Rabbi Rubenstein if he'll go ahead and open this up.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm really glad to be here. Always glad to represent Detroit as best I can. You know, just to be honest with everyone, and Leah will testify that she called me and I gave her every reason to find someone else to do this because I'm only marginally qualified, I think. I've been a rabbi here in Detroit for 15 years, which I guess should qualify me, but when I listen to the other panelists and I know their background and I know them, they have lots to say about Detroit that just a, I don't know, carpetbagger like me really can't compare to. I came to Detroit to be the rabbi of Congregation Beth Am. The reason we have an H is because our congregation used to be Congregation Beth Abraham, Hillel, Moses. And before that, it was 3 congregations. Not surprisingly, Congregation Beth Abraham, Beth Hillel, and Beth Moses, 3 separate congregations, Jews from different parts of Europe who established these different congregations. And I could tell you some of their older names too, but I think you get the idea. And I came here from Kansas City, Missouri, which was my first position. And before that, I had graduated from the Jewish Theological Seminary with, we just called him Adam back then, but you know him as Rabbi Kligfeld, for those who are members of Beth Am in LA. So Adam and I graduated and in 2000. And actually, we just had if you saw on his Facebook page a couple of weeks ago, we had a little reunion for our 20-year graduation. We had a Zoom reunion. So, you know, it's funny with the talk about Detroit and the fact that, you know, the bridge and the tunnel and the border and all of that. And, you know, just again, to be completely honest, I am sort of close to Detroit and also very much not in Detroit, as you'll hear, I'm sure, as the conversation goes on. But I'm in West Bloomfield. And West Bloomfield is a suburb of Detroit. We think of ourselves as part of Metro Detroit. And, you know, to some extent, at least in my own opinion, my humble opinion, suburbs are a lot alike in many different parts of the world. But and as I came to Detroit, I didn't really know Detroit much at all. I should have said even further back, I'm really a New Yorker at heart and remain that way. And Detroit was pretty far away from my mindset. I was really an East Coaster until I moved to Kansas City and then to Detroit. You know, I feel very, very lucky to have come to Detroit, both for the congregation I serve, the community that I'm a part of, and the city that, though I don't live in Detroit, again, the city that we are connected to. And over time, I've learned a bit about the history. I'm not going to really say much about the history because, again, you have people who can tell both the history of the Jewish community here and the city itself. But, you know, when I got here, people were still saying things like, using the phrase, you know, say good things about Detroit. And that's because that's a slogan that really predates me. But I think it was a way of encouraging people from this part of Michigan and from Metro Detroit to say things that, you know, put a nice face on Detroit and the troubles that it was having. I don't hear people say nice things about Detroit anymore because we don't have to struggle to find nice things. In fact, I'm sure you're going to hear over the course of this call really what a dynamic area of the country this is in all sorts of ways. And Jewishly as well. I'm really glad that the people on the call who are going to speak can really speak to that as well. So, you know, I think that's all I really wanted to share. I'm happy to, if anyone has any questions about, you know, my synagogue or you think that I can answer, but otherwise I'm happy to have you turn to the next speaker.
Great. Well, why don't we go ahead and turn it over to Arthur, who I'm going to make co-host. You are now the co-host.
Okay.
Thank you, Rabbi Rubenstein, for being on the call.
My pleasure.
Well, thank you. And Leah, thank you for inviting me. And it's nice to meet many of your fellow congregants virtually. And these days, since we've been quasi-sequestered or fully sequestered, it's certainly nice to see Rabbi Rubenstein, Rabbi Bennett, Steve Ingber, and Joel. I don't know if you're in Miami or back in Detroit yet, but always good to see you. A couple of quick comments, since I guess I can tee it up, since I'm supposed to provide kind of an overlay, if you will, is first and foremost, again, Josh Bennett, 25th anniversary at Temple Israel, the largest Reform congregation in America. He can tell you more about that, but Yasher Koach, and I remember when you didn't have any white hair when you first came here. So
all rabbis go gray in the temple.
That's right, absolutely. And of course, Joel Tauber is
do you mind just sharing one more time your roles?
Oh, my role? Sure, yeah. I published the Detroit Jewish News. I've been doing it since 1986, and in my presentation, I'll give you a bit of an overlay. But the Jewish News has been publishing since 1942. There was a predecessor publication, and a lot of the history of Detroit and Jewish Detroit can even tie into those two publications and the change that happened around World War II with them. But that would be my role, and also with the foundation, really a repository of history of the community in many ways through a digital archive that we have. But what I did also want to say and give a shout out, of course, is to Joel Tauber, who's been one of my mentors and truly more than just a Detroit leader, an international leader, and one who still sets the pace that many of us can't keep up with. And also, I do want to mention Steve Ingber, who is really leading our federation during a time of transition as it seeks a new CEO, and during all of the challenges that every community is having. We're fortunate to have Steve, who's been really running the show and taking on added responsibilities during the transition. What I'm going to end up doing is giving you a bit of a presentation. I'm going to have a share screen. I actually have 7 or 8, so let's see if I hit the share screen, and I'm going to click on that. And there's my PowerPoint, and there I am. Great. So don't look too far ahead because this should be fun. But what Leah really asked me to do was to provide a Jewish communal overlay seen through my lens in the role that I've been here. And I should say, I am much like Rabbi Rubenstein, I am not a Detroit native. And that's the exception rather than the rule. I came here in 1986 from Baltimore, where I worked at the Baltimore Sun, and I was born and raised in New Haven, Connecticut, so East Coaster. But before digging into Jewish Detroit a little bit more, I wanted to share a snapshot with you of a Federation demographic study that was done in 2018. I think it'll give you a bit of a framing for the community. Currently, there are about 72,000 Jews living in about 31,500 Jewish households. 75% of Detroit Jews have always lived here. So this is a community that is very, very rooted. There's not a lot of in-migration and out-migration compared to places, say, like Los Angeles or a number of other communities. 72% are concentrated in Southeast Oakland County. So for the people who are on this, who are from Grosse Pointe, they're actually outliers in terms of where the core Jewish community is, or as it's defined. And almost 70% of those who are married in the Detroit Jewish community are in-married or conversionary married. So doing the math in reverse, just about 30% are intermarried, which is low compared to places like Los Angeles and other places. And one of the things about this community is, and as I found out, everybody here knows each other, or they think they should. You can't do that with 72,000 Jews, but the mindset of, gee, did we go to this camp? Did we go to this school? Were we in this fraternity or this sorority? You play that all the way through, and when you have such a core group of people who've been here for virtually their entire lives, you do have this sense that everybody feels like they know each other, or they should. And some will still argue with you that they do know all 72,000 in this community. One more overview, and that relates to the Detroit metropolitan area itself. It's about 4.1 million people. The city of Detroit has about 670,000 people, 530,000 who are African American. Just as a comparison point, in 1950, the city of Detroit's population was almost 1.9 million. It was the 5th largest US city and very close to the number 4 city at the time, Los Angeles. On a macro level, the city's white population, including its Jewish population, basically headed to the suburbs. And only recently has there been an uptick in mostly younger Jews moving back to the city, and almost exclusively along its main Woodward Avenue corridor. And one other footnote, though Ann Arbor is only about 40 minutes away from here, or where the core Jewish community is, it's not included as part of the Detroit Metro Airport, both geographically and in many ways also sociologically as well. It's a wonderful place, but it is a different place compared to how certainly Jewish Detroit sees itself. So, how do we frame Jewish Detroit? Yes, Jews first settled in the Detroit area before the Revolutionary War. They followed the waterways, the canals that led to the Great Lakes. Their stories were typical: fur traders, peddlers of merchandise, owners of dry goods stores. Mid-19th century influx of German immigrants, followed by successive waves from Eastern Europe. Tensions between those groups, not unlike in other American cities, existed. So far, kind of a bit boring, kind of sounds like a lot of communities. But at the dawn of the 20th century, Detroit was no longer a boring place. In fact, it was becoming a global center for research, development, and innovation, all centered around the automobile. Companies started and failed, fortunes were made and lost. Competition was intense. Think of it as an industrial Silicon Valley. And the Jews of Detroit, those who already lived here and the tens of thousands more who came, were fundamentally impacted by the economic, social, and political influences of the automobile industry, and they remain so to this day. So it enabled a broad swath of Detroit's Jews to pursue and attain the American dream. So you have a slide in front of you because it's trivia time. All right, in 1902, Max and Morris Grabowski were among those in the thick of the automobile sweepstakes, and they ended up selling their company in 1911 to the newly formed General Motors Truck Company. Some of you on this call may be driving the successor to Grabowski's vehicle. It's called the GMC. Some quip that the GMC insignia actually stands for Grabowski Motor Company, not General Motors Corporation. But speaking of General Motors, shortly after forming its truck company, General Motors hired the man you see in this picture, Lithuanian-born Meyer Prentice. And he quickly rose through the ranks to become GM's treasurer in 1917. And he lasted a long time there. Another trivia question. Has there ever been a Jewish CEO of one of the big three? Big three being, in our term, GM, Ford, and Chrysler. Well, the answer is yes. Henry Ford's company actually had a Jew as its CEO up until a few years ago named Mark Fields. And while we're at it, during the Lee Iacocca era at Chrysler, the vice chairman was also Jewish, Jerry Greenwald. Final trivia question about how many parts go into making a typical automobile. About 30,000. So remember that number because I'm going to touch on it again in a few minutes. So quite simply, the automobile industry was the ticket to the American dream, either directly or indirectly for Detroit's Jewish community. And while some toiled on the assembly lines and some were instrumental in shaping unions, such as United Auto Workers, and men like Meyer Prentice were definitely the exception in corporate leadership, Jewish entrepreneurs built their businesses by providing products and services, whether they came in the front door, as they say, or went out the back door. Jewish businesses made everything from windshield glass to hood ornaments to lug nuts for wheels. And they made their shmata rag businesses into huge linen and uniform supply companies, wiping cloth companies. They hauled out slag byproduct from the massive Ford Rouge complex and converted it into paving material for roadbeds across America. They hauled away and repurposed manufacturing waste, including scrap used for the shaping of new steel. In later years, as the United Automobile Workers and other unions continued to negotiate better contracts for its members, other employers in the area were compelled to provide similar benefits in order to attract and retain workers. The result, Cadillac-level benefits that financially uplifted Jewish physicians, podiatrists, chiropractors, pharmacists, dentists, and the list goes on and on and on. So to understand Jewish Detroit, it's important to understand the impact of the automobile industry in its totality, not just the big three. And remember, almost all of those 30,000 automobile parts were made by somebody other than General Motors, Ford, and Chrysler. Though pursuing the American dream was their focus, Jewish Detroiters had to overcome the fact that Detroit was also the global center for anti-Semitism in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. I mean, how many communities can boast of having not one, but two anti-Semites who Hitler, Goebbels, and other Nazis admired and even quoted? There was Henry Ford and his Dearborn Independent, the International Jew, reprinting portions of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion in his publication. And by the way, Jews in Detroit were particularly offended when the President of the United States recently visited a Ford facility in nearby Ypsilanti and commented about Henry Ford's quote unquote good bloodlines. And there was Father Charles Coughlin, whose national radio broadcast about Jews could still blister paint. In Jewish Detroit during those decades, You largely kept your head down, tried to be good Americans, and took care of each other through a growing network of Jewish health, social services, educational, and athletic organizations. And those were largely coordinated and led by the Jewish Welfare Federation in Detroit. As an aside, even the wicked Charles Coughlin came around to tolerating Jews. This is a picture from 1964, which ran in our newspaper. And there's Father Coughlin, if you can see it, holding a pen, and he is purchasing a $500 Israel bond. And in the story, it says Father Coughlin bought the Israel bond because, quote, all people need to have a roof over their heads. So there he is, Father Charles Coughlin. Who would have thought, for those trivia buffs out there, yes, he did buy Israel bonds. And my guess is somebody at the Israel bonds office made it into a marketing pitch that they maybe should be using even these days. So it was during the difficult period leading up to World War II and the impending destruction of European Jewry that the Jewish News was founded to compete with an existing Jewish publication that was only lukewarm on Zionism. You'll note that the first ever edition of the Jewish News, which is on your screen, included a photo of Jewish baseball hero and idol Hank Greenberg in uniform, not for the Detroit Tigers, but for Uncle Sam. It was a reinforcement of Jews as patriotic and strong, and if any of you are in the newspaper business, it probably helped sell a few newspapers too. The Jewish News and its founder, Phil Slomovitz, were national leaders in the Zionist cause, and by this time, the Detroit Jewish community was already providing national leadership for the cause. The founding of Israel, hailed on the cover of the Jewish News, still gives me goosebumps, but it captured the overwhelming pride of the Detroit Jewish community. Now, it was during this time that a new generation of Detroit Jewish communal leadership was emerging, most personified by Max Fisher. Quite simply, he modeled what Jewish leadership was, locally, nationally, and internationally. From the Federation boardroom to Detroit City Hall, from the White House to Jerusalem, and with apologies to Hamilton the musical, he was in the room where it happened. I'm sure that Joel Tauber in his remarks will reference Max Fisher as the role model for generations of Detroit's exceptional Jewish leaders. Well, for the Detroit Jewish community, 1967 was the turning point. There was euphoria over Israel's success during the Six-Day War, but barely 6 or 7 weeks later, Detroit was in flames, and the exodus of Jews out of the city and into the suburbs already underway intensified. So the Detroit metropolitan area today is one of America's most segregated. Virtually all Jewish communal infrastructure, including Federation, moved out of the city. Detroit is one of America's most impoverished cities, with 47% of its adults functionally illiterate. 47% of its adults are functionally illiterate. The city hit bottom when it went into bankruptcy in 2013, the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history. But the city has been making a comeback, slowly and unequally to be sure, but it now has a vibrant commercial, retail, and residential strip along Woodward Avenue and pockets of renewal in other neighborhoods. But when you have a city and infrastructure that was built for 1.8 million people, with 1.2 million fewer residents, you are facing almost endless decay and difficulties. Driving most of Detroit's revitalization is a Jewish businessman, Dan Gilbert. Now, if you look at this cover, I think it really speaks to something at the core of Detroit and Jewish Detroit. There is something called Detroit Homecoming, which is a very large annual event that brings people really from all over the country and in some cases the world back to Detroit because they were born here or they got their start here. A subset of that event every year has been Jewish Detroit homecoming. So if you look at this particular picture in a nutshell, you'll see at the top in the middle, there are three people. The man on the right is Dan Gilbert. The man in the middle is the mayor of Detroit, Mike Duggan. The man on the left is somebody you may know from Los Angeles, Arn Tellem. Arn Tellem is the vice chair of the company that owns, among other things, the Detroit Pistons. He was Kobe Bryant's agent when Kobe came out of high school, before, of course, he made his claim to fame. The gentleman on the right with a microphone is Stephen Ross. Some of you may know Stephen Ross as the owner of the Miami Dolphins. You may know him as his name on the business school at the University of Michigan. Stephen Ross is a Detroiter. The man on the left holding the Chanukiah is Jeffrey Sachs. If you're a New Yorker or if you're an economist, he is an economics professor at Columbia University. He rebuilt Poland's economy. He is one of the world's top economists. He's a Detroiter as well. And then the bottom you see, somebody who is now the new head of the Milwaukee Federation. And you see, I think a young adult or next gen president as well. But this really captures in many ways what Detroit is, and it's kind of multi-generational connectivity. So with Dan Gilbert, when no one was moving their businesses into Detroit, he relocated his operations from the suburbs, and he proceeded to transform a key part of the city, bringing young talent, support businesses, and remarkable creativity to an otherwise underwhelming landscape. In the past, young Jewish Detroiters wanted to be like Max Fisher. Now young Jewish Detroiters want to be like Dan Gilbert. Different styles of leadership for sure, but both rooted in the Detroit Jewish community. So today, Detroit is one of America's great Jewish communities. It is also a great place to live and raise a family. The Jewish News Foundation's William Davidson Digital Archive of Jewish Detroit history captures more than 100 consecutive years of the community's story. Go look up any of the people on this call from Detroit, either the presenters or even if they used to live in Detroit and they're in Flagstaff or wherever they may be, and I bet you'll find yourself. More than 330,000 pages, easily searchable. People like Joel Tauber, Steve Ingber, Rabbi Josh, Rabbi Rubenstein are adding to our community story every day. And I will note that it's, I think, very fitting for this presentation that on the day that we announced the launch of the archive, the other person on the front page was Penny Blumenstein. Penny Blumenstein was, among other things, the first female president of the Jewish Federation of Metropolitan Detroit. And in this story, Penny just became the international chair, the chair of the American Joint Distribution Committee. Again, part of that exporting of leadership from Detroit. So what I would encourage you to do, extend your virtual tour after you've heard from the other speakers. Go visit the digital archive. If you have a pen, it's www.djnfoundation.org. Look any of us up. Look up any of the history. It's the community's DNA. And with that, Leah, thank you again for including me on the panel. And I'm looking forward to hearing how my colleagues in Detroit will continue to inform you about the uniqueness of Detroit in Jewish Detroit. So thanks.
Thank you so much, Arthur, for that amazing presentation. I really had no idea how many leaders have come out of Detroit. And I'm thrilled that we will hear from one of them, Joel Tauber, in just a bit. But thank you again. And if you could type in the chat section the link, so if people want to click on that, that would be great. But before we talk to Joel, why don't we hear from Rabbi Bennett, one of the rabbis of the largest Reform synagogue in the world with 3,500 families, which is amazing. So Rabbi Bennett, thank you so much for being on here.
Thank you, Leah. Thank you, Arthur, for that incredible history.
Yes.
It's a wonderful place for us to jump off from as the rest of us get a chance to share a little bit about our individual connection points to that storyline that you shared. It's really a great honor for me to be here because I represent Temple Israel, where I have served, as you heard, for the last 25 years. Actually, it's 26 years, but we couldn't get around to my 25th anniversary celebration last year, so it just sounds better to do 25. Next weekend, I'll be celebrating digitally a wonderful quarter of a century here at Temple. I actually grew up in Chicago, went to the University of Illinois, where I received a bachelor's degree in psychology, and then went right to Hebrew Union College in Jerusalem and Cincinnati. And this is my first and only job. And that is something really unique that I'll share in a moment. But before I get to the specifics of Temple Israel, I want to make a link here to what Arthur shared. I learned today that the Jewish News started in that World War II moment of Zionism, and that's interesting to me because Temple Israel also began for the same reasons at the same time. In those days, actually Detroit is really unique because almost every congregation here has stemmed from one congregation, Temple Bethel, which it was a classical Reform congregation in its day, now really more of a mainstream Reform congregation. But for a variety of reasons over the course of years, congregations have grown from their relationships with Temple Bethel. The Temple Israel story is in that World War II moment when one of the young rabbis of Temple Bethel, Rabbi Leon Fromm of blessed memory, made the decision to gather with 30 families who were pro-Zionist. This was new in the Reform movement. There were, for the most part, not Zionist movements yet in Reform Judaism. So in the early 40s, Rabbi Fromm made the decision to leave his post as one of the rabbis at Temple Bethel and to gather actually in the basement amphitheater of the Detroit Institute for Arts. Now, the DIA is very famous for a lot of reasons, including that we have one of the original castings of the Thinker statue outside our museum. We have the very famous Diego Rivera murals in the museum. But for me, the core of that museum is in the basement in a small amphitheater where Rabbi Fromm met with those 30 families and opened up the doors of Temple Israel, which at that time really had its only platform as being the first Detroit Zionist congregation. From that point, if you follow Arthur's history line, you'll see that just as Zionism spurred Temple Israel to be created and the riots moved Judaism from the city to the suburbs, Temple Israel was the beneficiary of that product, of that process. So yes, we started in our earliest days with Rabbi Fromm, who then soon added Rabbi Monty Syme, who actually, we were talking about Winnipeg earlier. Rabbi Syme came from Winnipeg and was an Orthodox Jew growing up, but became a Reform rabbi. He was the second rabbi of Temple Israel. They added Cantor Harold Orbach to the team, who was a virtuoso voice, really a classical Reform voice in the world of the Cantorate, who had both the ability to be pop as an artist, but also with traditional chazanut. And that trio, Rabbi Fromm, Rabbi Syme, and Cantor Orbach, grew the congregation through 1967 out into the suburbs to West Bloomfield, and along the way took a 30-family congregation of Zionists and turned it into today's 3,500 family behemoth in West Bloomfield, Michigan. Now, why it happened is really a series of anomalies. It starts with Zionism. It includes the riots as a move to a suburban community that's growing in Detroit. I believe it really has to do with a little bit of luck. So we've grown to become 6 full-time pulpit rabbis, now 2 cantors. The rabbis include, I'll just give their names so that they can get credit for the work that they're doing at Temple Israel. The eldest of our rabbis is Rabbi Harold Loss. Rabbi Paul Yedwab is next in line. I'm the third in line. Rabbi Marla Hornston is just after me, followed by Rabbi Jennifer Kaluzny, and at the youngest of our colleagues is Rabbi Jennifer Lader. We also have a rabbi educator, Rabbi Ariana Gordon, who grew up in the congregation. She was one of my youth group members, went on to rabbinic school, and then was hired as our rabbinic educator. We have a full-time early childhood center with 175 permanent students. We have the country's only family life center, which is an embedded social services agency inside our congregation, a full-time social worker who's working with our congregation on programming. We have a program director, a full staff. The staff of Temple Israel, including our maintenance staff, is over 200 people. So we're an enormous entity that is serving the Jewish community both as a community center and as a religious institution. But what makes Temple Israel special is not just the programming that we do and the relationships that we have built over time, but a few important things that you should notice. One is that Rabbi Saim of blessed memory, Rabbi Fromm of blessed memory, never served any other congregations after coming to Temple Israel. In fact, no rabbi has ever left Temple Israel in our history. Now that's unique. I'll tell you a quick story. When I came to Temple Israel, it was about the time in 1994 when the movie The Firm was popular in theaters. If you remember the movie, there were colleagues of the law firm whose pictures were on the wall, and when they were asked where they were, the answer was they were always in the Bahamas. Now that was a euphemism for them being killed and no longer a part of the firm. When I came to interview at Temple Israel, Rabbi Loss, who is now my senior colleague, was in Israel with a family mission. I saw his picture on the wall and asked who it was. And they said, oh, he's in Israel, which I, of course, thought meant it was a euphemism for he's no longer at the congregation. But it really is unique because we at Temple Israel have a continuity that other rabbinic colleagues don't get to experience. As I said earlier, two of my youth group members, when I was running the youth program in my first few years of my service to the congregation, they are now my colleagues serving as rabbis. The people that I was youth group rabbi to, I had the opportunity to marry, to officiate at their baby namings, to be with them at their children's b'nai mitzvah, to marry their children, and ultimately, potentially to bury their grandparents and their parents. That continuity makes us different than any other congregation in the country. We also have no contracts as rabbis, which leads to my next comment about what makes Temple Israel special. And that is that there is a unique relationship between our professional staff, our clergy staff, and our lay leadership. Let me give you an understanding of what that means. Every Tuesday morning, we gather around a conference table with all of our clergy and all of our staff and our president every Tuesday, who takes 3 hours out of their workday to be with us in the boardroom. Every Tuesday evening or every other Tuesday evening, the clergy is invited to the executive committee meetings and to our board meetings. So the clergy and the congregational leadership, our lay leadership, see ourselves as partners in what we're doing. We have a peer accountability model where we look around the table and hold one another accountable simply because we are in that room forever. We have to live with one another beyond a single contract, but for a lifetime. And that allows us to be visionaries in seeing the world of Judaism beyond just this week's parasha, this particular holiday, or even this year's programming. And that's really unbelievable. But I'll tell you, that partnership extends even beyond the congregational world. And this may be a perfect lead into some of the other speakers on our call today, because Detroit is one of the most unique places in Jewish life today in that we have unbelievable relationships between congregational worlds and the Federation world. When I came from Chicago, where I grew up, the Federation community talked about the synagogues as enemies and vice versa. Here in Detroit, we are full partners. Our teen mission, an Israel program for high school students, is led by rabbis, but facilitated by a community camp and funded by Federation. We sit on committees at Federation. Federation members come to our congregational board meetings. We have a synergy that links our Jewish communal institutions to our community institutions and our synagogues in a way that I think no other community in the entire United States can boast. And so if you follow that trajectory that Arthur started with, that perfect history and the congregational history that I've described, you'll see that we are moving in a trajectory first out into the suburbs, now back into the city in terms of our presence there. But along the way, there are partnerships that are unbreakable. And those partnerships make it really easy to be not only a person of the clergy, but to be a member of one of these institutions, whether it's a smaller conservative shul like Rabbi Rubenstein's or a larger Reform synagogue like Temple Israel. We see each other as building the future of a community together. And that really is the secret sauce, the magic that I think makes Temple Israel special, but also the Detroit Jewish community special. And before I stop talking, I'll just mention, I was hopeful that I would be in the temple today so that I could give you a quick tour. I can't do that, but you can see my background today. That is the Temple Israel Ark. It's a replica, obviously, of the biblical version of the Ark of the Covenant in our sanctuary that seats just over 1,100 people. And on either side, you can't see, this is artwork that is the splitting of the Red Sea. It's a mosaic, but just out on the outside, you cannot see it. But we are the first congregation in the United States to install 9-foot by 12-foot LED digital screens where we are able to stream videos and do Torah cams where we read the Torah with a video cam, watching a student read. Use those screens to amplify our services, to add words onto the screen. It's really a remarkable balance between old and new, and that is echoed on the far end of our building where we have the first ever Reform movement mikvah, fully kosher, but a mikvah used in a Reform way, so not only for conversions and family purity, but also for example, rituals around things like survivors of cancer, people who've come through abuse and other challenging moments in life, post-divorce rituals. There are wonderful ways where Temple Israel is able to balance the old, the Ark of the Covenant, with the new screens, the old ritual immersion with the new understandings of where we can be as a Jewish community. So from our very beginnings, with Zionism as a force moving us forward, to today, we continue to really span the spectrum of what it means to be a Jew.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Rabbi Bennett, for that. And I also want to thank you. With 3,500 families, I imagine you are being pulled in many different directions. So thank you for taking the time to do this. And, you know, we'll hear, you were mentioning the Federation. We will hear from Stephen in just a bit. Before we go to Stephen, let's hear from one of the biggest movers and shakers, not only in Detroit, but in the world, really, in the Jewish community. So Joel, I'm going to ask to unmute you, Joel Tauber. You there, Joel? I think he might have disappeared for a second.
Oh, wait, here it is.
There you go.
Okay. All right. I figure I'm not too good at the technologies. That's a difficult position that you've put me into because I've had 4 previous speakers, all very outstanding. And what they were talking about, and I'm sure Steve is going to talk about as well, is my life. Somewhat of a different approach from the other conversations. I lived all the things that they were talking about. And truth be known, I could spend my 15 minutes talking about relationships in each of their institutions and each of their organizations that I spent a good deal of time with, all 3 of the previous speakers. I was born and raised here in Detroit, educated in Michigan. My grandparents came over, as many of our grandparents did, from the shtetls of Eastern Europe, created a large family here in Detroit. We lived in the inner city of Detroit, was now the inner city because that was also the Jewish neighborhood where I was raised. I went to Cheder School, Yeshiva Beth Yehuda, through my bar mitzvah. And after that, I didn't participate too much in Jewish education, some Sunday services. So that was my Jewish education. But I went on to the University of Michigan, where I received 3 degrees in MBA, BBA, and a JD. Got also a honorary degree from Tel Aviv University. So I had a good background, all here in Detroit. When I got out of school, I came into the community, entered the manufacturing business, an auto supplier. Arthur mentioned some of the 30,000 parts. I was one of those parts suppliers. Again, having multiple plants in Detroit and around the world, mainly in auto supply, but in other industries as well. The nice part was when I came back to Detroit, I was immediately accepted into the Jewish community. Shortly after I was here a few years, I became the president of the junior division of the Federation. Somewhat condescending in today's terms, but nonetheless, that was my initial connection to the community. I then became the treasurer of the Jewish Family Service. And then I went on to become the president of the Jewish Community Center. And I got involved nationally at the United Jewish Appeal, and they called their Young Leadership Cabinet. And that was my first aha moment as part of the Young Leadership Cabinet. And I define aha moments for all of you as an event that changes the direction of your life. My life change came at a concentration camp, Mauthausen. As I stood there and learned 30 or 40 or 50 ways that they had put Jews to death. Electrocution, experiments, torture, electrification, and then their favorite was parachuting off the top of the mountain at Mauthausen without a parachute. And I stood there in my 30s saying, how could this happen? I don't understand this. The inhumanity of man to man. At that time, I devoted myself to the Jewish people and to being as sure as one person could be that that type of thing could never, ever happen again. I remember well at that time, the generation, which were my parents and my grandparents. Don't tell anybody you're Jewish. It didn't work. So I have spoken out since that time for the last 50 years on the behalf of the Jewish people to protect us to the most that any one man could do. And with that change in my life, I became a zealot, focused on accomplishing my Jewish purposes. I came back to Detroit, and in sequence, I'm chairman of the campaign. I then became the president of the Federation and the chairman of the Federation. And that was pretty well my involvement in Detroit. But what's important for this meeting to me, and you've heard a little bit of it from the other speakers, is why is Detroit such a great community? What are the characteristics? What are the core values of Detroit that made me and a bunch of others? It's not important about me. It's what this city has done. Let me suggest a few of the reasons why Detroit is unique. And by the way, the other two at the time when I was involved in the Federation were Cleveland and Baltimore. Were the three outstanding leading communities in the entire world, not just the United States. The characteristics of all of them were a tradition, what I call Midwest values, which means concern for others and not ourselves. Mentors, compassion, a broad view of community, openness, goes, and it was said before, goes from Orthodox to Reform to Reconstructionists, all supportive of each other, not competitive. Our leadership was supportive of one another. To illustrate these, what I want to do is give you a few stories of my life that are occurrences, not because of the stories, but I think they illustrate the kind of community that we have. When I was involved with the Jewish Center, we built the largest Jewish center at that time in the country, maybe the world, and it's still the largest in square footage center in the United States. The trouble with it was we couldn't afford it. And there were a lot of problems with the building. And I I was a vice president or something, I wanted to sue the engineers and the architect, but they were Jewish. So they said, no, you can't sue them. Federation would not give us more money to subsidize our budget. So we came up with a plan of adding 4 additional racquetball courts to a facility that already had 8 of them. An insane idea. But the reason we did that is because we could sell a lot of memberships to the health club, which would balance our budget. The Federation said absolutely not. The leaders, the machers said, no way. I garnered our Jewish Community Center, went to a board meeting one evening, and it was unusually an evening, and it was done because some of those that were going to vote for the Jewish Center were elderly, and they figured they'd fall asleep or they wouldn't show up at the meeting. So we had a debate, and we won. Who ever heard of a debate at a federation meeting? We won 16-13. And I said to myself as I walked out, I'm done. That's the end of my Jewish life. I took on and beat the 3 leaders of our community from the federation, and that's it. I was entirely wrong. Those 3 mentored me and worked with me all through my career. Story 2. I was in my 20s. I went to a meeting called, was alluded to, the Fisher meeting. That's a meeting where you had to donate $100,000 in the 1960s. You know what $100,000 was in the 60s compared to today. And I watched in awe as these 30 men or so got up and gave 100,000, 200, 300,000, and chided each other for not giving enough, and working with each other, trying to raise more money for the support of Israel, because we were Zionists, and for the community itself. These meetings continued on. When I became campaign chairman, we still had the Fisher meeting. We still had the minimum of 100,000. I raised from our 60,000 Jews at that time, $19 million. We had 20,000 gifts out of a 65,000 person community. And that continued on until last November. We still had a Fisher meeting. We're the only community that I'm aware of that gets up and gives gifts voluntarily and announces them and is proud He cajoled me. He supported me in everything that I did. And it wasn't only Max. We had, coming out of Detroit, these 70,000, at that time 60, we had 3 chairmen of the United Jewish Appeal. We had 3 chairmen, presidents of the Council of Jewish Federations. We had 2 presidents of the Joint Distribution Committee. That's the kind of skill level we got out of Detroit because of some of this history. And what did it mean to me personally, this great foundation that I was given as a gift? I went on after Detroit, become chairman of the United Jewish Appeal, became the chairman of the council, the vice chairman of the Council of Jewish Federations. I was head of the merger group and the founding chairman of the JFNA, Jewish Federations of North America. But the titles are not very important. It's really what was done during that time. So we had this great base in Detroit that they invested in me and others, that we were able to do some things for the Jewish people that made a difference. We brought 1 million 200,000 people from the former Soviet Union to Israel, 200,000 to the United States. Stop and think about that just for a second. 1,200,000 people you picked up from a country, moved them with one bag across the world, didn't have the language, didn't have the structures, the social structures, didn't the Jewish base that we had, but we moved them. And in the middle of it all, we brought 30,000 Jews from Ethiopia. And even
That's
today,
amazing.
still involved at this late point in my life, trying to elevate the Ethiopian community in Israel so that they will have an equal opportunity with every other Israel. And we're doing that through a unique philanthropic effort that's never been tried before. A very simple process. We ask the people, the Ethiopians, what do you need to move forward? Not, I have a great program and here's a program for you. What do you need? What do you want? And then we trace them from cradle to career, supplying the programs as we went along.
Oh,
Those are the kinds of things that we're going through now. And I think you can see in my later years here, I'm a very happy man.
Wow, that's so wonderful.
It's been a great run. Minute on happiness. I think that is, from an older guy, the ultimate goal in life is happiness. Two of the major elements of happiness, and this is scientifically proven, are relationship and giving back. That's the heart of it.
Absolutely.
In the relationships that I've developed through my Jewish involvement, my children, my grandchildren are all involved in Jewish life, strength of relationships. Giving back, I think the story describes giving back. So I suggest to all of you, if you want to get a great degree of happiness and satisfaction in your life, develop strong, meaningful relationships, deep relationships, and make a difference in life.
Thank you so much, Joel. What an amazing story and inspiration to us all that, yes, taking action really is the root of happiness. Thank you for taking the time to do this. And now we're going to go ahead and turn it over to Stephen, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Sure. Thanks for putting this all together. It's truly a treat to be with people who don't know that I haven't made a bunch of mistakes yet and who still are interested to hear what I have to say. I just want to briefly give a quick history of where I came from, and then I'll turn it over real quickly. I'm one of the few people on this panel that was actually born and raised here in Detroit, a lifelong Detroiter. I come from the private sector, was in the automotive world, and lo and behold, the opportunity opened up to become the chief operating officer of the Federation. And people said, "You're crazy." I said, it'd be fun, it'd be a challenge. And they said, "What are you doing going from a company where you have one boss to going to a company where you have 71,000, although maybe 72,000, we're right in there, bosses. Who wants to do that with 100,000 opinions?" But I took it, and I haven't turned back since. I've been at this 4 years. Actually, I'm not the CEO. I just want to correct that, just for those in case some of my bosses are still listening. We don't have a CEO right now. I'm still the COO. We're operating without one. We were hoping to get one, and then obviously COVID has come in, and that's sort of changed us. So it's been an interesting time to be in Detroit. It's a great city. I will tell you, pound for pound, which is what we like to refer to it as, this is the best Jewish community. We raise more money on a per capita basis than any other community in the country. And the number of young upstarts we have in this community is really phenomenal. Where we've come from in 2008, where everybody was graduating college and leaving, to now people are graduating college and moving into the city, is something that this city has never seen in decades. What Dan Gilbert, who we've talked about, and Joel Tauber and many others have done to lay the groundwork for what is happening at the Renaissance here in the city of Detroit and the suburbs is truly phenomenal. One thing that I always like to touch on when we do this is while we call ourselves the Jewish Federation of Metropolitan Detroit, we're actually beginning to maybe look at, do we take metropolitan out? We started in Detroit. We've all moved. The Jewish migration was north and west constantly. And now for the first time in our Jewish history, we are actually now contracting, not necessarily in size, but in how spread out we are. And we're actually moving back into the city core center, which is interesting because, you know, it's what we couldn't, you know, office buildings you couldn't give away 30 years ago when the Federation sold it. Now we're all kicking ourselves wishing we still owned prime real estate right downtown. Also, real quickly, so that everybody understands, we sit at a federation that has 17 agencies, 4 schools, a camp, and a bunch of social service agencies, University Hillels. And it's really a community where people look at it as one community. It's not, you know, all spaced out. You can get from one side of the community to another in less than 10 or 15 minutes. So it's a really tight-knit community. And it's a phenomenal community to work with. And it's been fun. This COVID challenge has been a challenge, you know, just like everybody else in the country has gone through. And I think we've done it and succeeded so well as a Jewish community that we start out every single morning with a call with every social service agency, every school in town, some cemeteries, some rabbis, whoever wants to join. I can meet a call every single morning so that we can start out with what is going on and what are the problems that people are facing and how can we move resources around in this community to do that. And I think that is what is made, that's the secret sauce that makes Detroit, is that no one's worried about egos and this is my territory and why are you doing this program? It's how can we best the community and better it? And through that, I really feel like we are a stronger community. And if there's one thing you take away, that's the secret sauce. This is a true community where I can call Rabbi Bennett or Joel Tauber or Arthur Horowitz and get an opinion and move things around and really make it so that we're one big family. And I know that sounds contrite, but that's really what this is. I'll meet with the Michigan Board of Rabbis next Tuesday. That's unheard of in other cities. Federations don't meet with rabbis like that. And we'll discuss, you know, high holidays and whatnot and how we can help them. We meet with all the social services. We meet with schools. We have social service people working from one agency at another right now at a home for senior citizens because they were short people because of COVID. And it's really been remarkable what our city has been able to pitch in and do together. So I don't want to keep you past my time. I just want to tell you a little bit about how great this city is and open it up to, I guess, either questions or comments or, you know, like I like to end all my meetings, you know, complaints, we'll take those too. So whatever it is you can, we're always willing to learn whether we want to or not. So thank you for inviting us.
Thank you, Stephen. So yeah, as he said, why don't we go ahead and open this up for questions to any of our panelists. So let's start with you, Paul.
Me?
Yes. Paul.
Can you hear me?
Now we can hear you.
I'm sorry, you froze up there for a minute. Yeah, I have a question for the publisher of the Jewish News. How do you compare and contrast your publication to Los Angeles' Jewish Journal?
Sure.
In terms of editorial policy and editorial content?
Sure. Well, I'll start with that. When we talk about Jewish leadership coming from Detroit, one of the key leaders of the Los Angeles Jewish Journal is a Detroit native named Irwin Field. So we import them not just to the rabbinate or to United Jewish Appeal, but actually some of the best talent out there came from Detroit. The Jewish News, when it was started in 1942 by Phil Slomovitz, started out as an independent for-profit publication. There was a publication that started in 1916, as I mentioned earlier, that wasn't, it was anti-Zionist and then became lukewarm with the times. And the situation in Los Angeles is a bit different. In Detroit, because of that close-knit nature, if you recall, I mentioned in my presentation that everybody in Detroit knows each other or thinks they should. So as a publisher of the Jewish News, that's music to my ears because it means people are buying the Jewish News. They all subscribe, they pay for it, and they're reading it and they're saying not, I don't, you know, this is Los Angeles, there are, you know, 1 million Jews or 500,000 Jews, I don't know them all, to, gee, that's so-and-so's nephew who just died, or that's so-and-so's cousin who's being honored, who you remember when we lived in Dexter Davison area, he used to be the guy you got your pickles from, at Grunt's when you came out of Mumford or something like that. So I think fundamentally Los Angeles is a sprawling Jewish community, and for many years the Federation there had challenges with the Jewish Journal in terms of what to do with it. And I think they've done a good job. Rob Eshman was the editor there for many years, an old friend of mine. I think the dynamics of the community are such that in Detroit, because of that closeness, you have the kinds of stories that you can write that in Los Angeles, people wouldn't care because they don't expect to know each other. So many people in Los Angeles are from somewhere else. So I think I would put that really as kind of a foundation at the core of how you would cover the community in different ways. Though the Journal has really done in recent years a very nice job of kind of coming back from the dead, or almost the dead.
Thank you.
So before we get to the Friedmans, I just want to mention tomorrow we're going to be in Boston at 11 a.m. California time, 2 p.m. Florida time. We're going to be joined by MIT's Rabbi and the Hillel VP of Programs, and from Brandeis University, the Hillel Rabbi and the president of Hillel and the president of the Orthodox organization. So I just want to mention that for tomorrow. And with that said, let's hear from the Friedmans.
I have a question about a couple of the neighboring communities. And I was wondering, I know in Dearborn you have a very large Arab and Muslim population, I think perhaps the largest in the country. And I was wondering what the relationship is, if there is one, between that community and the Jewish community. And as a side note, I know that there's a synagogue in Ann Arbor that has had pro-Palestinian demonstrators in front of their synagogue every Shabbat for the last, I don't know, dozen years or so. So I just wondered if you could comment on that.
Sure. I'll take the first half, and I'll let Arthur or Rabbi Bennett take the second half one. Yes, we are home to part of the largest Arab community outside of the Middle East. And to show you, and actually there's a question in the chat that I want to weave into the same thing. To show you our connectivity, it's unlike it anywhere else. The Jews and Arabs of Metro Detroit get along better than the Jews and Arabs of the Middle East. I was on a call today with the governor and myself representing the Jewish community, and two of my counterparts from the Chaldean and from the Arab American Muslim access group. We get money from the state for social services, that we get some that are designated to the Jews and some that are designated to the Arabs, and we work together on that. It's called a multicultural grant. So we actually sit and caucus with them, and we deal with them all the time. We have a the AJC, JCRC here, which has a group that meets with Arabs on a daily basis. I will also tell you the relationship between the Jewish community and the African American community. I think again here it's Detroit is really special in that we live amongst each other. It's not a segregated community like you would see, because it's not such a sprawling community. As far as I was on a conference, I don't know, my days are getting mixed up, but earlier in the week with two pastors, and they said, I said, what are the next steps that we as sort of white Jews in the area can do to help in your cause? And they sort of said, our biggest thing from the leadership, what we need right now is you to help tell our story. As Jews, you guys are so good at telling your story and saying, getting behind a cause and telling your history. And these two pastors were saying, we really are struggling with it. And they came to us for help. How do we help us tell our story? And that's really what we do. So long story short, I know I'm babbling, but I would say the relationships are phenomenal. But you wouldn't think it from outside. How could such a small community of Jews and such a large community of Arabs get together and live peacefully? And I will tell you, we do. Could it be better? Look, I'm not going to sit here and say it's harmonious. I think it's somewhat separate, but we work together, and I think we are breaking down those walls. And I'll turn it over to Arthur. Or Rabbi.
Let me chime in there.
Yeah.
Because a little bit of history. One of the things I did was I was chairman of the National Council of Christians, Jews, and Arabs. And during the 9/11, I went on television to urge people not to react against our Arab community, mainly in Dearborn. And there were no attacks during that time. So this goes back some 30 or 40 years, Steve, on the kinds of things that you're enjoying and seeing. It's a relationship we built over many, many years.
Let me just talk a little bit about two things that were mentioned. One, just last week in the aftermath of the George Floyd killing, the Jewish community has an active partnership with what's called the Black Jewish Coalition, led by clergy in our community. Because of that ongoing partnership, we were able to participate together in a very police positive march downtown. So more than 2,000 people led by Black leaders and Jewish leaders walked with the mayor of Detroit and the governor of Detroit. And those relationships happen now because of the ongoing connection between communities. So it really stems all the way back from Jews who stood outside of their storefronts in 1967 and held on to their community during the riots to an ongoing relationship that really still exists today. So that's one answer. I want to just talk briefly about Ann Arbor, though. Ann Arbor, as Steve earlier mentioned, is kind of a separate community, not really aligned 100% with Detroit. It's also, because it's a university town, a fairly typical left of center, more liberal community than what maybe a typical suburban Jewish community might look like. Having said that, there are in Ann Arbor pockets of pro-Palestinians, but in this case, the people who are standing outside of the synagogue, the conservative shul there, are actually Jews. It's not a Palestinian group. It's a group of Jews who every Shabbos come and sit outside and protest. By the way, that's still happening even during COVID, while the synagogue is completely online. So I find that really interesting. The protests are happening on Shabbos morning, even while the Jews aren't in the synagogue. It really is only a couple of people, but it reminds me of a wonderful story from about 10 years ago. Here in Detroit, we have a fairly prominent grocer who owns several small grocery stores in a chain called Hiller's Grocery Markets. And at the time was a very, very ardent supporter of Israel. Because of his connection to Israel and because he was a Jew, the Arab community of Ann Arbor was protesting his store for a number of days. Mr. Hiller, in his infinite wisdom, walked outside at that protest one day and said, "For every day that you are here, I will give an additional $10,000 to Israel for the support of Israeli produce and politics." So it took only 10 days before the protesters realized that their presence in front of his store was actually benefiting the state of Israel. So it's an interesting way of diffusing what could have been a very difficult time. And instead, those relationships, as Steve mentioned, have really evolved into very positive, powerful partnerships.
Wonderful.
I don't want to be the demographic guy here, but just to put a couple quick overlays on the question regarding Dearborn and the Middle Eastern community here. Dearborn is always referenced as, gee, the largest concentration of people from the Middle East. Dearborn as a city is about 95,000 people. About 40% of Dearborn's population are from the Middle East. So it's kind of overstated in terms of Dearborn. It's almost symbolic. The Detroit metropolitan area has over 400,000 people from the Middle East. However, it's a bit like baklava, maybe, if I can use that expression, because you have people who are Maronite Christians from Lebanon who've been here for 4 generations, 5 generations. You have Yemenis who are Shias who, and then in Dearborn and certain other areas, you have Shias from southern Lebanon, largely Hezbollah, Bekaa Valley area. But then you have Shias from Iraq who don't talk to the Shias from southern Lebanon. And then, of course, Ramallah, the largest concentration of people from Ramallah is in the Detroit metropolitan area, large Syrian population. And as Josh Bennett knows from work that he's done for years, a Chaldean population. Chaldeans are Iraqi Christians. largest concentration outside of the Middle East. The last number I saw was about 140,000, 130,000 trained in the Jesuit tradition, by the way. So you have a very much of a patchwork of collectively, you have 400,000 or 500,000 people with Middle Eastern backgrounds. But when you start to pull it back, you see that you have all of these subgroups, and many of those groups have better relations with the Jewish community than they have with each other.
Wow. I want to mention we have an amazing organization in Los Angeles, Newground, a Muslim-Jewish Partnership for Change, and they're really, you know, in these times, the partnerships you find between the communities has just been extraordinary to have each other's back and support each other. Okay, so Roger will be the last question.
Yeah, well, I don't have a question, I have a comment. My name is Roger Lieb. Rabbi Bennett, you'll certainly recognize the last name. And Arthur, you may as well. But I wanted to say that growing up in Detroit, I couldn't agree with you more that we had the feeling that we knew everyone in the city. It took going to a school other than Mumford, downtown Cass Tech, to realize there were other people and other groups in the city who we didn't know, because it was such a remarkably tight Jewish community. And opening up the the Jewish news, I'm seconding what you're saying. There were always familiar names of people you knew, or people who your relatives or friends knew. In contrast to here in LA, where I live now, very different. It's a very disparate community. There's not as high a level of synagogue affiliation by any means. And it's heartwarming to hear this presentation and your talks about Detroit, because I remain very fond of the experience growing up there.
Wonderful. Well, with that said, I was just reading the question that just came up, more so that there's a large Facebook group called Detroit Jewish History. So if you guys want to find that on Facebook, you can learn more. But I just want to take a moment to thank everybody who showed up today and gave your time. Rabbi Rubenstein, Arthur, Rabbi Bennett, Stephen, Joel. This was just an excellent presentation. So thank you for your time. And we'll see you tomorrow, and enjoy the rest of your day. And again, thank you so much. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
All right. Take care.
Thank you.